There's another Evil Dead movie coming out, which is something I don't get to say often, so let's take advantage of it and check out unanswered questions about the Evil Dead movies. And there's a lot of them. And I mean, this is my second volume. I've already done one episode of unanswered questions about Evil Dead. So make sure you check that one out so you're not repeating those same questions down in the comments. But let's check it out to see what we can make sense of. Or else we're gonna be dead by dawn. Question number 1. How does the possession even work? This is one that is a bit creepy in the long run because it's not really clear how the possession by the Deadites works in the first place. Like, there's questions to be asked about how they do it and how it all works. First up, what makes them able to take hold of you in the first place? At times, it seems like it can just grab a hold of anyone, but for some reasons, there's people it can't take as well. For example, in the first film, it has no trouble taking possession of Cheryl, Shelly, or Linda, and later on just picks up Scotty as well. But it doesn't seem to be able to get its mitts on Ash. Now, there's a couple of different theories here, and one is that the body needs to be damaged in some way. Cheryl had the incident in the woods, which is how it got into her, sorry, and Linda is stabbed in the ankle with the pencil. Plus, Scotty's all torn up by the woods. But what about Shelly? It just smashes through the window and possesses her, so it seems like it should have done that to Ash as well, right? The other theory is the one I like, and that's that it could actually have taken Ash at any time. Literally. And the whole movie is the evil force just playing with him and pushing him to the edge. The very ending of the movie showed that it could easily do so, and it did. So all of the efforts that the other Deadite forms were taking in getting into the cabin to attack him were just them having fun in the torment. If it wanted the whole thing over in the first 10 seconds of them reading the book, then it could have. But that's not what it wanted. But here's the thing, that interpretation doesn't hold up in the second film. The evil genuinely seems challenged there and can't quite get its hooks into the cabin inhabitants. So there must be a reason and rhyme to it. Here's what we see. You can get taken over by these methods. You can be directly attacked by the forest creature. This happens to Cheryl, and also I guess Mia in the remake. And the evil in the woods takes them directly. You seemingly have to be outside in the woods for this to occur. And you can also seemingly be bitten by one, which can have a different effect. Ash's hand is bitten by the Linda head, which in turn infects him, but only his hand. We don't see any other evidence of this anywhere in the series, so it's possible that the possession is not directly because of the bite, but it certainly seems coincidental that the bitten hand ends up with the effects. Finally, it seems like direct injury from the evil forces can also allow you to take them. Ed is taken because of Henrietta's assault, Linda is taken through the pencil stabbing, so there's some stuff to consider here. First up, Ash. He gets possessed technically 3 times. Once at the beginning of part 2, once near the ending, and his hand. We've talked about the hand, but what about the other 2 times? Well, at the ending of part 1 and the beginning of part 2, he's outside in the open of the woods, and the creature directly attacks him and injures him. That's the direct assault. That's covered in one of the methods, sort of a combination of Cheryl's and Linda's possessions. He's directly attacked by the force itself, like Cheryl, and then injured by the tree, the Linda method. Later on, he's injured by the cutting off of the hand and allows the Deadite access to him. But then, shouldn't they be able to get into him at any time? Good question. And that's the last little rub, because there's someone we're forgetting in all of this. Shelly. She wasn't injured, wasn't in the woods, and didn't get bitten. So, the final piece of this puzzle is sheer will. The evil can also take those with a weak will at any time, and perhaps that's where the injuries come in. The more you're injured, the more you lose your focus and your will and drive, letting it just take you. Shelly was weaker-willed in general, so was able to just take her. Ed was likely of a pretty weak will, considering all it took was a little head bump to give the demons access. Ash, however, and Annie are very strong-willed individuals, and therefore the evil has a really hard time getting a hold of their souls. The only reason it's able to get back into Ash is because he lost both his hand and has now been beaten down by Jake. But again, not long after, he's able to reassert his will through memory and force the Deadite out of himself. So let's break that down. Say you're a strong-willed individual and you walk out into the woods. So the invisible force can straight up attack you, getting into you that way, because you're no match for that thing. But then, if you're in the safety of the cabin, it can't get you. So it needs to wear you down, break you, if you will, by gravely injuring you or just making you crack from the pressure, giving it access to your soul. And yeah, I know. Another answer is you get possessed because Sam Raimi says you get possessed. And if that's your first thought, just know that people think you're not fun at parties. Question number 2. What's the sleeping arrangement at the cabin? So this one is wacky, right? I don't know why this isn't thought of more, especially since we see the entirety of the cabin. Like, we watch Ash run through all of it. He runs through the front door into the living room area, through a door and into the kitchen, down the hall, and into a doorway on the left, which is bedroom 1. He then smashes through a door there and into bedroom 2, and then back into the hallway, right where the kitchen is again, and then back down the hall and into a door on the right now, which is the bathroom, which has some sort of weird door that leads to a hallway behind the walls, and then back to the hallway where he goes back into the living room. And here's where we see that first bedroom is right up against the living room. So in this scene, there's 2 doors that we don't see him enter. There's this one, which is simply the door from the bedroom to the living room. And this one, which we get to see in use right after the infamous work shed. This is the back door of the cabin. Now, that's the layout in the second movie. But when you compare it to the first movie, it seems to be ever so slightly different. It has to be, because when you break this all down, there's nowhere for everyone to sleep. The piano room has no bed, so there's only one bedroom here for Ash and Linda. Even if you had this same layout in the first movie and got this piano out of there and put in a bed, that still leaves Cheryl without a bedroom. So the first movie's layout is different, possibly, but when we take a look at the room layout, it appears to be the same. And this scene of the force outside the cabin lets us know that it's set up the same. There's the front living room, the bedroom Scott and Shelley are in, and the second bedroom where Cheryl is. And when she exits, that room is right next to the back door. So the layout is basically the same. But here's where we see it. There are 2 beds in this room, and Cheryl is hanging here. So it appears as if Ash and Linda are sleeping in the same room as Ash's sister Cheryl, which is why they're getting all romantic in the living room, away from that buzzkill, right? Question number 3. Who's that guy standing in the woods? All right, this one's not really a question and more, I guess, a fun fact and a complaint. But I guess that the crew are on their way to the cabin, and they have to cross that old dangerous bridge. But as they do, there's this creepy dude just watching them from the bushes. Who is this guy? Well, I know, you're probably just saying that he's just some guy. Much like the 2 guys on the side of the road earlier. He's nothing special, right? Just some dude. Okay, fine. If that's true, pause this video. Go put on your copy of The Evil Dead and watch this scene, and you tell me if that's true. I'll wait. Oh, you're back. You unpaused it. Well, was he just some dude? What's that? He wasn't in your version? He just vanished? Well, here's the scoop. That guy is actually Rob Tappert, producer of The Evil Dead and friend of Sam. It's assumed that he was supposed to be like out of frame in that shot, but ended up getting in there somehow anyway. It's really no big deal. He's just a guy in the woods. But for some reason, I guess that it bothered someone that he was there, whether it was Rob himself or Sam or whatever, but somebody decided to remove him. Because of that, every modern release of the film has digitally removed him, leaving this weird patch of trees or something there in his place. It's really kind of weird because it was so unnoticeable before, and if you did happen to see him there, well, it was just a guy. Nothing really that off about it. But now, if you see it, you can't unsee it. And it looks like a random assortment of pixels that shouldn't be there. Question number 4. Is the book in a time loop? Oh boy, more time loop questions. Thought we were done with this with the Terminator episode. Well, anyway, here's one that got asked of me a while back, and I thought it was interesting enough to bring up. Obviously, because of the events of the ending of the second movie, time travel is involved. We also know that at least the events of Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness exist in a linear timeline, in that time doesn't change. The nature of time travel is gone into a touch more on the TV show, but we're focusing on the movies right now, since that shouldn't factor into this question. But what we can tell is that even though Ash was in the present, he saw himself in the Book of the Dead and had clearly already been in the past. But again, it's not in a linear timeline. It's not like a loop or anything. It's just time out of order. When Evil Dead 2 happens, the events of Army of Darkness had already occurred in the past. But the question is whether or not the book in the past is the same from the one in the future. It's what's known as the bootstrap paradox, and refers to an object that theoretically only exists due to time travel. Like say I'm Christopher Reeves, and I have a watch that was given to me by some lady, and I go back in time, and I meet that lady as a young woman, and I gave her the watch. It only exists in the past because I, Christopher Reeves, took it there. But it doesn't exist in the future because I took it back into the past. It's an impossible object in that no one created or built it. It just exists. So, is the book one of those? Did the book exist in the past of Army of Darkness simply because of the time rift that Ash created? Well, that's a tricky answer because we don't know for certain if the book actually went to the past. Keep in mind, the Necronomicon isn't really in the second film that much. It's in the prologue, but doesn't factor into the main story at all. And it's in fact the pages that cause all the shenanigans. The book is still presumably burned up in the fireplace, and when we see the stuff go back in the past, it doesn't appear to be there. So I think we can safely say that it's not transported there. So it is in fact not a bootstrap paradox. It's still burnt up in the fireplace. But wait a second, because now it's time to blow minds. What about the evil itself? Here's the scoop. When they read the incantation, it's to send the evil back in time. Ash just gets caught up in it and is transported as well. But what happens to him is clearly the desired effect for what they wanted to do to the Deadites' force. But when Ash crash lands in the past, it's not there with him, even though his car is. But yeah, not everything that goes through that portal is there either. So where did that stuff go? And how did it affect the evil having sent it there? Well, here's how. The evil force is a freaking bootstrap paradox. The portal is just an open portal to time. Things that go through it end up in the past, but not necessarily at the same time or place. When Ash arrived in the past, the evil was already spreading. It was already there. What if the evil arrived in the past, from the future, sent there by Ash, and was in fact the same evil he ended up facing in the medieval era? Perhaps it landed further in the past from Ash and became the very dark ones that wrote the book, and then they were called up again in the present day, only to be sent back where they came from. That would mean that the evil only exists because of the spell. It appeared in the past, sent from the future, and existed there until modern times, in which it would fulfill the circle and be sent back once more. Any way you slice it, the evil had to go somewhere when he sent it back in time. So it has to at least be partially presumed to exist in that same time era as him at one point or another. Question number 5. Where does Ash get the shotgun from in Army? This is one that was actually brought up by one of my patrons, Mike, from the YouTube channel Intoxicated Masculinity. He asked about this one, and it is a little confusing. When Ash is captured by Arthur's men at the beginning of Army of Darkness, they take his shotgun and chainsaw. Later on, he's tossed into the pit, devoid of any weapons, but is rather gloriously reunited with his saw thanks to the intervention of the old wise man. But then, shortly after, when confronted by Arthur himself with a sword, Ash mysteriously and magically has his shotgun in his hand and shoots it. But where does it come from? As Ash crawls out of the pit, we get a good look at the sheath on his back, and the gun is not there, so it's very clear that he didn't have it on him. And you'd assume if he did, he'd have used it on the pit witch, but it just sort of appears. Now, I've seen some people saying that you can see him grabbing it off of the cowardly soldier, but that's not true. I think they're talking about this scene here, but he's not grabbing his shotgun here. He's grabbing that soldier's whip weapon, and he throws it at him. You can tell this because in the very next shot, Ash is empty-handed, and his shotgun sheath is empty still. No, in fact, in all the versions of the film, the gun appears from nowhere. But there is a place that shows where it comes from. It's actually in the Dark Horse comic book adaptation of the film that this question is answered. There, we see a gorgeous illustration that while Arthur is talking, Ash simply grabs his gun from the nearby horse and then shoots. Considering the people would not have recognized it as a weapon, they most likely weren't that concerned with him grabbing it, but very soon after would realize their mistake because you do not mess with the boomstick. Yeah! Question number 6. How does Bad Ash have both hands? So Bad Ash is weird. In Army of Darkness, he's the main villain. And how he's even formed is really odd. So our hero is barricaded up in a windmill with the unseen force right outside, and he settles in for the night. At one point, he shatters a mirror, creating a multitude of tiny images of himself in each of the shards, and those images emerge and cause chaos. Now, this is pretty wild because the evil hasn't really shown this sort of ability before, and it seems weird that it can just manifest a mini army like this. There is precedence considering it made that doppelganger Ash appear in the mirror in part 2, but it's kind of debatable if that's even real or just a hallucination of Ashley. But anyway, strange power addition aside, the mini Ashes attack, annoying and assaulting him, with one of them eventually swan diving directly down his throat. The big dummy then just straight chugs boiling hot water, which seemingly kills it, but I guess somehow it just melts him down into Ash's essence and then merges with him, eventually splitting off of him as a mirror image, an evil duplicate. But here's the thing, he has both hands. And what's weird is that the mini Ashes did have the robot hand, but it was reversed because they were mirror images. But when it goes full size, it has both hands, which is extra weird because look at the way it forms. In this bit, it's clear that he's forming his own body. And at this point, it looks like there's a section of him that is fully formed off of him. And it has the metal hand. He's even using it to torment Ash, smacking him in the face with it. In this scene, we can clearly see that he's forming a separate body, but when they fully separate, even though Bad Ash took the right side of him to form from, he has two good hands, while Ash still has the metal one. But how can that be? Well, this is pretty simple because of one magic word, and oh yeah, it's magic. Yes, Bad Ash is an evil magical entity, which should be obvious from the moment that he, formed himself out of a tiny mirror shard. But when in Ash's belly, it's possessing him in a way, much like it did with his hand in the last film, and forms the duplicate. At this last point, when we see him separate away from good Ash, he leaves him with a new arm created out of nowhere. Essentially, Bad Ash, magically I guess, popped the metal one over to his arm and he formed out a new one. Because he's magic, right? I mean, it can also be seen as a form of gloating, like why not form himself with two intact hands, just kind of rub that in there. Not that it really seemed to bother Ash that much, although maybe it did, and that was part of the reason for the quick shotgun blast. But did he really need another reason? Like, this dude just jumped down his throat and formed himself a body out of his shoulder. I'm surprised they didn't pop him sooner. Question number 7. Did Army of Darkness even happen? So this is a tricky one because there's all sorts of legal rights issues involved, but what it breaks down to is that when they made Ash vs. Evil Dead, the TV show, they didn't have the rights to Army of Darkness, so they kinda had to pretend it didn't exist. That's why you don't see the Metal Knight's hand as the show starts, and there's no mention of his medieval adventures. But did they even happen? Well, it would be pretty easy to say that they just didn't happen, considering that the opening of that movie showed Ash and Linda going to the cabin alone, but in continuity of the show, he took up Linda, Cheryl, Scott, and Shelley. So it could just be a universe in which the events of Part 2 happened, hence the missing hand, but minus the time travel aspect at the end. Now, in the show, there's some vague allusions to Army, in that there's a bit where he fights a bunch of dolls similar to the mini Ash fight, and at one point there's a bad Ash in a way, and he does eventually get a robot hand much like the one from the past. But then in season 2, Ash does mention that he traveled in time, and behind the scenes the show's creative team has confirmed that the events of Army did indeed happen. They were just unable to discuss them on the show, but they could certainly make hints, and they do. So what I think is the best option is this. This is the universe of the first film. 5 people go to the cabin, they find the book in the basement, and it ends with Ash being launched through the woods. The events of Part 2 are pretty much just as we see them from that point. It's the same circumstances, except that it was more than just him and Linda going there. He did end up going back in time, like at the ending of that movie, and the events of Army of Darkness happened, but not in the precise same way, although close enough. Much like the ending there, he ended up returning to modern times, although it's likely that he didn't mess up that spell, since when evil occurs again, he seems rather surprised by it instead of just being something that he's been dealing with because of his verbiage blunder. Question number 8. How do Mia's wounds heal? In the remake, there's no Ash. It's a remake, and even though it's said to take place in the same continuity, none of the characters from the original are involved. Instead, the main characters are a brother and sister combo of David and Mia. For a while, it seems as if Mia is fulfilling the Cheryl role, as she's the one attacked by the trees in the woods, and she's taken first by the Deadites, and it appears as if David is going to be our Ash. Over the course of the next hour or so, Mia attacks the group and does quite a bit of self-harm along the way, most notably slicing her own tongue open. And I mean, her skin is pockmarked and scabbed, and she's in, we'll call it bodily disarray. But then, David discovers that there's a way to purge the evil from her soul, and in order to do so, he must bury her while she's still alive, which he then does. He's successful here, and she's restored, but when that happens, she's completely healed. Like it looks like nothing ever happened, and her tongue is fine. Now, we've seen the Deadite able to revert back to human form before, like with Linda in the first or second film, and doing so seemed to clear up their skin issues, but not major bodily damage. So how did that even happen? Well, I hate using just one word to clear things up, but I guess I'm doing it twice here, but magic. The spell is apparently more than just a simple soul restoration kind of thing. It doesn't just purge the evil from your body, but it seems as if it also completely reverses any of the effects of the possession. The curious bit about this is how extensive would that really be? If any of the others, including say Natalie, remained alive and he did this same thing to her, would her arms be restored? Is it essentially a mystic healing remedy? I'm assuming it would not also heal her addiction and would only apply to maladies incurred during the Deadite possession. Like it's kind of weird that this would have that effect, since it's reported to just be a method to purge the evil from your body. But I guess that somehow it suggests that the harm done to oneself is more or less mystical in nature and not technically physical. And you know, that creates an interesting dilemma when it comes to Ash's hand, since that wound was delivered through means of possession. If he or it were to be buried and then restored in this manner, would he get his hand back? I guess that's a question for another day. Question number 9. And hey, in the remake, does it even get 5 souls? So the Necronomicon here has a passage that says that once the beast feeds on 5 souls, then the abomination will rise again. At the ending of the movie, guess what happens? Yep, that's right, the abomination indeed rises. And I'm not really sure what everyone was so afraid of with this thing, because it's like remarkably easy to kill. Less an abomination and more of like a firecracker-ination, am I right? So this is tricky, right? Because I guess it depends on when all this starts. But when Eric unleashes the evil by reading from the book, we see it get Mia, and we'll come back to her. But we then have Olivia. She's possessed and then killed by head smash. There's then Natalie. She gets possessed too. And then Eric. He's also possessed. But that's only 4. David does die, but he's never possessed, so he's just killed. But then, get this, the book says that there's ways to purify the Deadites, and those methods are live burial, dismemberment, or burning. So, I don't know about you, but Eric sure as hell looked like he got burned, right? Wouldn't that count as purification? Doesn't that mean his soul would be cleared? Doesn't that take 1 away? And then Mia is buried alive, so that obviously clears her soul. Like we see it. So that takes it down to only 2. But then, get this, after Natalie is possessed and she loses both of her arms, she looks human before she dies, which sure does seem to imply that the whole dismemberment thing worked, and she was also purified, which means that the abomination only has 1 freaking soul. Like, I suppose you could also include the girl from the intro, but she was also burned, which again is said to be one of those purification things that keep your soul intact, so it really shouldn't count. It's possible that the girl in the beginning's mother could be one of those souls, but we don't see her possessed or anything. It's just said that the girl killed her, so I don't think that there's reason to think that she was taken. Like, I know that in the original cut, Mia ends up still possessed, and there's a shot of David being possessed as well. But number 1, those aren't canon because they're not in the film. And B, even if David was possessed, he was burned up. Again, purification. And maybe this is just me, but I think that the stuff from the intro does not count. Like, I think that it's when Eric reads the words and wakes the evil that it begins. And I think that even though the book says that it needs to feed on 5 souls, I think it's more simplistic than that. I think it just needs 5 deaths. And it has them. Like, there's Olivia, then Natalie, then Eric, and then David. So that's 4. So now, some people believe that Mia's death was the 5th one, and burying her alive and then reviving her counts as a death. Like, she was dead for a moment, so that's a very possible answer. But there's another one here too, and that's Grandpa, like the dog. Mia kills it right after being possessed, and I know it's just a dog, but is it ever just a dog? Really? Now, I kind of hate that it comes down to that it's just 5 deaths after they made such a big deal about it needing 5 souls, and then they even went about spelling out the way to purify those souls to keep it out of the beast's hands. But hey, that's how it goes sometimes, I guess. Question number 10. What about the Necronomicon in Jason Goes to Hell? When people talk about the Evil Dead movies, something that doesn't instantly come to mind is Jason Voorhees, but there's a tiny moment that ties the 2 franchises together. In Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, our main handcuffed jumping hero is investigating the old Voorhees house, and on a desk is a book that looks very much like the fabled Notorum Demondo, the Book of the Dead. Now, it being there is a bit of behind-the-scenes fun because director Adam Marcus is a big Evil Dead fan and wanted to pay tribute to the series. After all, the ED movies did this themselves by popping a Freddy Krueger glove in the basement of the cabin, so it seemed like the right thing to do. The book is actually the exact prop from Army of Darkness and was borrowed from Sam Raimi with his blessings to have in there. So it's the real deal in terms of the prop itself. But Marcus takes it one step further than that. He says that it's the actual Necronomicon and that Jason is indeed the product of the book and is in fact a Deadite. He goes on to say that Pamela, so distraught at the death of her son, decided to use a bit of black magic to bring Jason back, and read from the book in order to make it happen, which is why he shifts from a young boy to a full-grown adult in the gap between parts 1 and 2. And a lot, and I mean a lot, of fans have embraced this concept and will tell you that Jason is actually a Deadite. Well, I'm here to poop on all of that. First of all, in a previous Friday the 13th Unanswered Questions video, I discussed this a bit and talked about how Jason is not a Deadite. I get into that much more there, so I'll just sum that up by saying that the book simply gives the dead license to possess the living, not reanimate a whole person. The Jason we see in parts 2, 3, and 4 acts nothing like any of the Deadites that we've seen in the Evil Dead movies, TV show, or even the comics. Before he's killed in part 4, Jason's just a guy who kills people, and his actions don't match anything you've seen from a Deadite. He's still Jason, still worships his mother. Again, something Deadites don't do because they have no connection to the person that they're possessing and only exhibit those traits to mess with someone. Plus, he's seen in the sunlight, something that we know Deadites don't do. But again, there's more about that in the other video. But here instead, I'm going to talk about how that book cannot possibly be the same book that we know from this series proper. The first thing that I'm going to touch on is the book itself. It's in freaking Kandarian. The entire reason that Professor Nobi had that book up at the cabin in the first place is to translate it. Look at these pages. It's not like Pamela could just use Google Translate on it or something because A, it wasn't invented yet, and B, I looked, Kandarian is not an option. The characters aren't even anything recognizable, so it's not like she could have just sounded it out phonetically. So, in order for that whole scenario to be believable, she'd have had to know about the book, seek it out, and then find a professor who is skilled in Kandarian to translate it for her and be like, oh yeah, sure, read this to bring back your dead son. But beyond that, come on, did you really think that the freaking movie timelines guy wasn't going to point out that the timeline doesn't work? According to her tombstone in part 4, Pamela died in 1979, so that's when the first movie took place. Although some people take issue with that and place it in 1980 because of the day and date on screen in the movie, which lines up with 80 instead of 79, but I think it's 79. But regardless, okay, it gets a bit shifty here because of the weird sort of reboot at the beginning of Evil Dead 2, but we find out that Nobi is there at the cabin to translate the book, and he has his wife with him, and they have just discovered the book in the ruins in a castle. We see this happen in part 2, and their official dating of that event appears to be in 1982. Although if you're going with just the first Evil Dead film, the absolute earliest it could have happened would be 1981, or maybe if we stretch it, late 80. With the events of Pamela's death occurring at the absolute latest, the beginning of the summer of 1980, but more likely 1979, that book is still locked away in that Kandarian castle somewhere overseas. But according to the Friday theory, Pamela would have had the book in her possession before that, and then just had it in her house, where it sat untouched for decades until Steven went in there during the events of the film. If it was in the house since she used it in 79 or 80, then how is it present for the events of the Evil Dead films? Well, it wasn't, because that's not the Necronomicon, and Jason is not a Deadite. Now, this may be some sort of alternate reality version of the book that only exists in this universe, and the two continuities are not shared. That's certainly a possibility. But even if that were true, I'm still not getting how Pamela Voorhees, country bumpkin who cooks at a camp, can suddenly match a professor for translating abilities and then finds a way to utilize a spell in the book that can bring her son back from the dead without the typical possession stuff that normally happens. And I know that there's usually one answer per episode that seems to stir up people in the comments section, and why do I think this will be that one? So there you have it, 10 more questions about the Evil Dead movies. I hope these were answered to your satisfaction. There's definitely more questions to ask about these. I don't really get into the TV show too much with these episodes, mainly because of the sheer volume of information, although there is stuff to be gained from there, but it's kind of hard because there's so many different writers and so many different episodes that things kind of like factor off a little bit in different ways. So I mainly stick to the movies, but if you have questions or answers that do revolve around a TV show, I'd like to hear those down below as well too. Give me some more on these, and if you enjoyed these, please consider hitting that like button. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you like what you see and you want more episodes of unanswered questions coming your way in your notifications. Hit that little bell as well. If you think about it, go to Movie Timelines, the Patreon page, patreon.com/movietimelines, and you can help support this channel and be a patron like these guys are. I certainly would appreciate that, and I appreciate you just watching, and I'll see you very, very shortly for another great video. Thanks a lot, guys, and bye-bye.